At first glance, this ancient structure might just look like a pile of old rocks tucked away in the wilderness, weathered, quiet, forgotten by time. It's the kind of thing tourists snap photos of, maybe shrug at and then move on. But what if we told you it's not what you think? What if those stones weren't just leftovers from a long-lost civilization, but clues to something far darker? A new discovery has completely flipped the script, and scientists are more than just surprised, they're disturbed. Buried beneath this seemingly harmless monument lies a truth that's not only unsettling, but something that was likely hidden on purpose. The question now isn't just who built it, but what they were trying to hide. And here's where it gets worse. If this structure wasn't built the way we thought, or for the reasons we assumed, it means everything we believed about the people who created it is wrong. We used to marvel at their ingenuity. Now we might have to reckon with the cost. This might not be a monument to ancient wisdom, but a symbol of sacrifice, of struggle, and of a civilization that gave everything, maybe even their lives, to complete it. What was once seen as a cultural triumph might actually be a warning written in stone. Let's start with what we know, at least what we thought we knew. This structure has stood in the same spot for thousands of years, smack in the middle of an open plain. Massive stones, some towering over 13 feet high and weighing up to 25 tons, arranged in a circular pattern. No mortar, no metal fasteners, just stone balanced on stone, placed with eerie precision. And the most mind-blowing part? It was built before the invention of the wheel. No cranes, no trucks, just ropes, wooden sledges, and sheer determination. It's so old that when the ancient Romans showed up, it was already ancient to them. For generations, people have tried to explain what this monument was for. Some believed it was a burial site, pointing to the human remains found nearby. Others said it was a temple for sun worshippers, a sacred ground for ceremonies, or even a giant celestial calendar. And to be fair, the idea of a solar calendar isn't completely off. Recent studies show that the monument's layout lines up with solstices and equinoxes. There are even researchers who think it was designed to track the 365.25-day solar year, with certain stones marking the start of each season. That would have helped ancient farmers know when to plant crops, hold rituals, and prepare for winter. Pretty impressive stuff, but here's where things get weird. The deeper scientists dig, both literally and historically, the more cracks start to show in the old theories. This wasn't just a clever calendar or a place to bury the dead. New research suggests it may have been part of something much bigger and much more disturbing. Some of the stones, it turns out, came from over 150 miles away, suggesting they were moved intentionally, maybe even stolen, from another sacred site. And the more we look into how the structure was built, the less it looks like a symbol of unity or celebration, and more like the outcome of brutal effort, forced labor, and unthinkable sacrifice. It's starting to seem like this monument wasn't just a marvel, it was a burden, one that demanded everything from the people who created it. Now here's something that doesn't usually come up when people talk about ancient ruins: sound. You'd think a bunch of rocks wouldn't have much to say, but scientists recently tried something unusual. They built a scaled-down replica of the structure to study how sound traveled inside it, and what they found was kind of eerie. On the outside, everything was quiet. The massive stones seemed to block sound like a wall. But once you stepped inside the circle, it was a totally different story. Voices carried perfectly, music echoed. Even soft whispers in the center could be heard with clarity by those standing around the edges. And when some of the stones were struck, they rang out like musical instruments. This wasn't random, it was engineered. That kind of acoustic design doesn't just happen by accident, and it's not just the sound that's strange. The structure has always been wrapped in mystery, and the lack of written records left the door wide open for myths. One of the oldest stories claims the stones were brought from Ireland by the wizard Merlin, who used magic to carry them across the sea. Another legend says giants built it as a sacred dance ground. For centuries, people genuinely believed it was too massive and complex to be made by human hands, so the only explanation had to be magic or gods. or something otherworldly. It didn't help that no one could explain how the stones, some weighing as much as a modern locomotive, had been moved without machines. That kind of mystery just begged for a supernatural explanation. But modern science has done what myths never could. It gave us hard evidence. Researchers traced some of the stones back to remote parts of Wales, over 150 miles from the site. There are signs they were dragged using sledges, logs and ropes, over land, through rivers, even floated on primitive boats. It would have taken hundreds of people moving in perfect coordination, risking injury or worse. Which brings us to the twist. When you strip away the magic and really look at the facts, what's left isn't a tale of enchantment, it's a story of suffering. The acoustics, the transport, the scale, none of it was easy. None of it was kind. This wasn't just a place to gather. It was a place that demanded everything from the people who built it. Maybe the legends weren't just about magic, they were trying to mask the pain with wonder. At first, it just looks like a bunch of stones, cold, heavy, silent. But it turns out this ancient monument wasn't silent at all. In fact, when scientists tested how sound behaves inside it, they discovered something strange. While the outside world seems to fade away, the noise of wind, voices, even footsteps becoming muffled, the inside does the exact opposite. Voices echo, songs bounce off the stones, stand in the center and speak, and people along the edge can hear you clearly, almost like you're speaking through a natural amplifier. Some researchers even noted that when you strike certain stones, they ring out like gongs or bells. Not just noise, resonance, music. That kind of sound behavior isn't accidental. It suggests the space was designed not just to be seen, but to be heard. And that opens up a whole new set of questions. Was this a ceremonial site where sound played a sacred role? Were chants, songs, or rituals designed to be experienced by those inside the circle, while keeping outsiders in the dark, literally and acoustically? Maybe music wasn't just part of the ceremonies, it was the ceremony. When you're inside the monument and the acoustics kick in, it creates a feeling, something between a trance and a warning. It's haunting, powerful, almost supernatural. And speaking of supernatural, let's talk myths. The place has been the center of bizarre stories for centuries. One of the oldest legends says Merlin, the wizard from Arthurian myth, used magic to levitate the stones from Ireland. Other tales claim giants built it, placing each rock by hand during some ancient ritual dance. People just couldn't wrap their heads around the size, the precision, and the effort. So instead of logic, they filled the gaps with fantasy. But fantasy only goes so far. In recent years, science finally stepped in to pull the curtain back. Using mineral analysis, researchers tracked some of the smaller stones, called blue stones, back to quarries in Wales. That's more than 150 miles from the site. And the larger sarsen stones? They came from about 20 miles away, but still weighed upwards of 25 tons. Think about what that means. No wheels, no iron tools, no cranes. Just ropes, sledges, and hundreds of people dragging slabs of rock through forests, over rivers, across hills. Some archaeologists believe the builders used waterways to float the stones part of the way, then dragged them the rest. Either way, it was brutal, backbreaking, possibly deadly. And here's the twist most people don't want to face. The myths might have been a way to cover up the suffering. If you tell yourself the stones were moved by magic, you don't have to face the reality of how much blood and sweat it really took. But now we know better. This wasn't the work of wizards. It was the work of a civilization that pushed itself to the edge. What was once seen as a monument of mystery is now starting to look like a monument of endurance, of pain, and maybe even of control. A place where power wasn't just worshipped, it was enforced. And the voices you can still hear inside those stones, maybe they're echoes of more than just ceremony. Maybe they're echoes of everything it cost to make it happen. Maybe they're echoes of everything it cost to make it happen. For decades, researchers thought they had the altar stone figured out. It sat at the heart of the monument, literally the centerpiece, massive, weathered, and assumed to come from the same region as the rest of the blue stones, South Wales. That theory held for years. Until recently, A new study, using far more precise geochemical tools, quietly dropped a bombshell. When researchers reanalyzed the mineral makeup of the altar stone, they found something nobody expected. It didn't match any of the known Welsh sources. Not even close. The chemical signature pointed to somewhere much farther away, somewhere that had never been seriously considered before. The surprise match? Northern Scotland. Specifically, the Orcadian Basin, a rugged, remote region that includes Orkney, Caithness, and the shores of the Moray Firth. It's not just a different location, it's an entirely different geological world. The rock that makes up the altar stone shares a near-perfect match with sandstone found in this northern terrain, hundreds of miles from the site. And this wasn't a vague guess. The match was confirmed by mineral analysis, comparing microscopic grains and rare mineral traces that act like a geological fingerprint, which means that at least one of the most important stones in the entire structure didn't come from nearby, or even somewhat far away. It came from the other end of the island, a place no one had seriously linked to Stonehenge until now. This new discovery doesn't just rewrite the map, it rewrites the scale. Moving a 6-ton stone from northern Scotland to southern England without modern transport is not just difficult, it's almost unimaginable. We're talking nearly 500 miles across rivers, mountains, and open sea. And yet, some group, decided this one stone was so important it was worth the risk. That kind of journey would have taken months, maybe even years, requiring boats for some parts and overland hauling for the rest. Not to mention the coordination it would have taken to feed and support a labor force capable of that kind of job. You don't go through all that effort for just any rock. This wasn't about convenience. It was about meaning, and meaning that deep often comes with a cost. So what does it all mean? That's the part that really shakes things up. If the altar stone came from northern Scotland, it suggests that whoever built this monument wasn't just operating in one corner of Britain. They were connected across the entire island. From the Orkneys to Salisbury Plain, people were trading ideas, materials, and possibly even labor. That implies a cultural network far more advanced than we ever imagined for 2500 BCE. We used to think of these ancient communities as isolated, small farming groups cut off from each other by geography. But this stone tells a different story. One of long-distance relationships, shared beliefs, and coordinated effort across regions. Which also means Stonehenge wasn't just a local marvel. It may have been the centerpiece of a pan-British project, one that unified entire tribes under one sacred goal. Not because it was easy, but because something told them it had to be done. For most of history, the truth about this monument's creators was buried, literally. People could only guess who built it, when it was built, and why it even existed in the first place. Then came the 1800s. That's when archaeologists first started digging into the mystery, not just with curiosity, but with shovels. They uncovered burned pieces of wood, old tools, even Roman pottery, but none of it pointed to a clear answer. For a long time, it seemed like they had opened the ground and found more questions than answers. The site was ancient, that much was obvious. But how ancient? And who exactly were the hands that shaped it? It wasn't until 1862 that things started to change. That's when one researcher made an observation most others had missed. Among all the pottery shards and bits of debris, he found something that didn't belong: cremated human bones. Now that might not sound like a big deal on the surface, but to someone who understood burial traditions, it was everything. Cremation hadn't been common in the region for thousands of years. In fact, it hadn't been widely practiced since the Bronze Age, which meant this discovery just dated the monument by a lot. The structure wasn't Roman, it wasn't medieval, it wasn't some druidic temple from a few hundred years ago. It was far, far older. And that changed everything. Soon after, archaeologists began to connect the dots. Around 2400 BCE, a group of people known as the Bell Beaker culture arrived in Britain. They got their name from a specific kind of pottery they made, bell-shaped drinking vessels, often intricately decorated. But that's not all they brought. These people were among the first to work with bronze, a revolutionary metal at the time. Their tools were stronger, their craftsmanship more advanced, and their influence spread rapidly. So when researchers started finding bronze tools buried near the monument, tools that matched the bell beaker culture, it clicked. These weren't just visitors. They were builders, and their fingerprints were all over the site. The idea that the bell beaker people helped shape the monument isn't just a historical curiosity, it flips the narrative. For centuries, people believed the structure had some kind of magical origin, that it was made by giants or transported by wizards. But no, it was built by real humans, people who understood metalwork, people who cremated their dead, people who organized labor forces and carried out massive construction projects without modern technology. And that's where the story gets darker. Because now, we're not talking about magic or myth. We're talking about hundreds of individuals hauling stones, carving wood, digging trenches, and maybe even dying in the process. Building this wasn't a miracle. It was a mission, one that demanded everything they had. Just when scientists thought they were starting to understand the monument's story, something completely unexpected surfaced. The stones, those iconic blue stones arranged in the inner circle, weren't originally placed there. In fact, they weren't even from there. It turns out they had a whole other life, in a completely different monument, long before they ever made it to the site we know today. This theory, once dismissed as speculation, is now backed by serious archaeological evidence. And it all started with a remote dig in the hills of Wales. In the Preseli Hills, at a site called Warn Morn, archaeologists uncovered something strange. A circle of empty stone holes, spaced and shaped almost identically to the blue stones used in the monument. The holes had clearly once held standing stones, stones now missing. When measured and analyzed, the dimensions lined up almost perfectly with the blue stones that now sit miles away. Suddenly, the idea that these stones were reused didn't just seem possible. It started to look inevitable. They had been uprooted, moved, and reassembled over 150 miles away. That's not recycling. That's a relocation on a spiritual scale. Think about what that means. These stones weren't just construction materials. They weren't chosen for convenience or function. They were sacred. People didn't go through the ordeal of removing them from one holy site and dragging them across rivers, forests, and mountains for fun. They did it because the stones mattered, because they carried weight, not just physical, but cultural and spiritual. And that changes the entire narrative. It means the site we've been looking at as a standalone wonder might actually be the successor to an older, forgotten monument. A continuation of a story, not the beginning of one. And here's where it gets even more unnerving. This discovery suggests the monument wasn't just a local project. It was part of a much larger sacred network, a web of monuments, burial grounds, and stone circles stretching across the region. The stones themselves were moved like relics, perhaps even believed to be alive in some way. The decision to move them could have marked the end of one era and the beginning of another, which raises the question, what happened to the people who built the original circle? Why was their site abandoned, their stones taken, and their monument dismantled? Was it peaceful? Or was there something darker behind it, something we'll never fully understand? What's becoming clearer is this: the stones we see today are just the final chapter of a story that spans generations. They weren't placed there as decoration. They were reinstalled, carefully, deliberately, because someone wanted their power to continue. Which means the monument wasn't just built once. It was built, unbuilt, and built again. And that suggests something far more complex than we ever imagined. This wasn't just about engineering. It was about memory, ritual, and control. And it makes you wonder, how many other sacred sites were lost, stripped, or cannibalized to make this one rise? Most people think the monument was built all at once, some big, ancient effort that got finished and then left alone. But that couldn't be further from the truth. The truth is far more complicated, and a whole lot stranger. Scientists now know that the monument was constructed in stages over the course of centuries. The earliest part wasn't even made of stone. It began with a large circular ditch dug around 3000 BCE, forming the rough shape of the site we see today. Inside that ring, people placed a series of pits, now called the Aubrey Holes. No one knows exactly what was inside them, but many believe they once held wooden posts or even early stones. Either way, this first version of the monument was just the beginning. A few hundred years later, the real transformation happened. Around 2500 BCE, the builders brought in the massive sarsen stones, each one weighing as much as 25 tons, and stood them upright in carefully measured patterns. Some were placed in pairs with a third stone across the top, creating the iconic trilithons that define the monument's silhouette today. This stage required planning, mathematics, and massive manpower. Then came the blue stones, which had already been used in another monument. They were rearranged, shifted, and reconfigured multiple times over the next few hundred years, which tells us something important. The monument wasn't static. It evolved, it changed, and it stayed culturally relevant for generations. But the real shock came much later, when researchers stopped just looking at the stones and started looking underground. Using modern scanning technology, the Stonehenge Hidden Landscape Project uncovered a world that had been buried right beneath our feet. It turns out the site wasn't alone. Surrounding it for miles were burial mounds, deep pits, wooden structures, and ceremonial pathways, entire layers of prehistoric activity hidden from plain view. Some of these features are older than the stones themselves. Others appear to have been used long after, which means the area wasn't just a monument. It was a massive sacred complex used for rituals, gatherings, and maybe even processions that involved walking from one hidden site to another. And this is where the tone shifts. Because all of this, the stages, the changes, the buried structures, starts to paint a different picture. This wasn't a peaceful monument quietly watching over the landscape. It was a site of constant effort, control, and obsession. Something about it pulled people back over and over, generation after generation, like they were trying to get it right, or like they were afraid not to. The deeper scientists dig, the more it becomes clear that this wasn't just about honoring the past. It might have been about trying to control it. To anchor power in one place, to bind entire communities to one location through belief, ritual, and sacrifice. And if so much is still buried beneath this one monument, you have to wonder, what else is still hidden? What secrets are still waiting just below the surface, undisturbed, undocumented, and possibly unwanted? For centuries, when people looked at this monument, they didn't just see stones, they saw mystery. Something otherworldly, something too massive, too perfect, too ancient to be explained by anything as ordinary as human effort. And honestly, who could blame them? With stones standing taller than a house and weighing more than a truck, perfectly placed before the invention of the wheel, it almost begs for a supernatural explanation. So people made one, then another, and another. Before there was archaeology, there were legends, and this monument became the center of some of the most fantastical stories ever told. One of the oldest myths claims that the stones were brought from Ireland by Merlin, the wizard of Arthurian legend. According to the tale, he used magic to lift the stones and carry them across the sea effortlessly. Another story says that giants were the ones who placed the stones, dancing in circles and turning to stone themselves as part of some ancient curse. For a long time, these myths were the only explanations anyone had. And they weren't treated as entertainment, they were treated as truth. People genuinely believed this place was built by gods, or giants, or sorcerers, because the alternative was too hard to imagine. That regular humans, with no machines and no written language, built it all with their bare hands. Later, when the Roman Empire expanded into Britain, a new theory took hold, that the Romans had built it. After all, they were known for architecture, roads, aqueducts. It seemed to fit. But there was a problem. The site was already ancient by the time the Romans arrived. It didn't belong to them. And that wasn't the only wrong theory. In the 1700s and 1800s, people began saying it must have been built by the Druids, the priestly class of the ancient Celts. The monument looked like a place of worship, and since the Druids were known for performing rituals, the idea stuck. But again, science got in the way. Radiocarbon dating proved that the monument predated the Druids by more than 1,000 years. They may have used the site, but they didn't build it, so the myths fell. One by one, not because they were fun to debunk, but because they didn't match the evidence. What replaced them wasn't magical or legendary, it was hard science, and in some ways, it was even harder to believe. It turns out the people who built the monument weren't gods, giants or wizards. They were real people, people with families, with primitive tools, with no written records. People who cut down trees, carved wooden sledges, and dragged stones weighing tens of tons across rivers and hills, some from as far away as Scotland. These builders weren't mythical. They were resourceful, coordinated, and brutally determined. And suddenly, the story shifts from wonder to weight, because here's the reality. Building this wasn't a weekend project. It wasn't done out of convenience. It was something these people had to do, not just for themselves, but for their entire community, maybe even their survival. Moving stones that size without modern technology. That meant thousands of hours of labor, limited food, extreme weather, and almost certainly death, injuries, accidents, people who never lived to see the monument completed. And yet they kept going, which forces us to ask why. What belief was strong enough to justify that kind of sacrifice? That's the dark truth underneath all the myth. This wasn't a place of simple ceremony or curiosity. It was a site of obsession, maybe even control. A symbol that outlived its builders and swallowed generations. And as we now know, the monument wasn't built in peace. It was carved out through effort, endurance, and suffering. All the myths we created were, in a way, comfort stories. Easier to digest than the truth. Easier than imagining the human cost. Easier than facing the fact that greatness often comes with a price. So now we know. No giants, no spells. Just people, real, flawed, brilliant people, who believed so deeply in what they were building that they gave everything to make it real. So after all the myths, legends, theories, and breakthroughs, where does that leave us, honestly? With more questions than answers. We now know the monument wasn't built by gods or giants, but by people who faced unbelievable odds. We know it was part of something bigger, something sacred, something that spanned generations. And we know it came at a cost, one measured not in stone, but in sweat, pain, and sacrifice. What we once thought was a symbol of mystery is now something much heavier. A legacy, not of magic, but of endurance. Not of fantasy, but of belief so powerful it reshaped the land. But maybe that's what makes it even more incredible. What do you think? Was this monument a symbol of ancient wisdom, or a reminder of how far humans will go when they believe in something greater than themselves? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching. If you found this story as fascinating or unsettling as we did, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and we'll see you in the next video.